And this tells you just how critical sleep is to fighting for our health.
That swamps all other factors in terms of whether you're going to be healthy and happy at age 8 or age 108.
There are genetic risk factors. Your genes are important, but your lifestyle is just as important.
Outsourcing our cooking to corporations is killing us.
Sleep deprivation you feel may be causative now, or one of the causative factors that causes Alzheimer's disease.
That's right.
I'm thinking, well, I often say this when I'm teaching doctors, why are we not bringing up sleep quality with pretty much every single patient that walks in through our door?
Sleep really is the tide that raises all of the other health boats. It's just as you said, it's the superordinate node that if you manipulate it, it's like the Archimedes lever, you pull that, everything else, can start to come into play.
Yeah, you get the sleep better, it affects your brain, it affects your hormones, it affects your genetic expression, it affects all these sort of things that we might be looking for drugs to affect those individual pathways, but you can improve a lot of them by improving your sleep.
Yeah, and it's we think, well, that sounds almost too good, but don't forget, it took Mother Nature 3.6 million years to evolve this necessity of 8 hours of sleep in place, which I should note, by the way, that if you look at the data, back in the 1940s, the average adult was sleeping about 7.9 hours of sleep. Now that number here in the United Kingdom is closer to 6 hours and 30 minutes. In other words, within the space of 100 years, which is a blink of an evolutionary eye, we've lopped off almost 20% of our sleep need. How could that not come with demonstrable health and disease consequence? So I think, there's that component there. But I love what you were saying that, in medicine, we're often, or even in research and pharmaceuticals, we're often trying to sort of manipulate one pathway in one area of the metabolic system, or one aspect of the immune system, or one feature of the cardiovascular system. And, sleep affects all of those. And we can, I'll give you an example. Firstly, we know that if you get a patient and you have them sleeping just 6 hours for 1 week, this is someone, let's say, who is healthy. At the end of that 1 week of short sleep, their blood sugar levels are disrupted so significantly that they would be pre-diabetic, that you would diagnose them as being in a state of pre-diabetic.
Just from sleep deprivation.
Just from sleep deprivation. When you control all of the factors. You can also speak about sleep loss and the cardiovascular system. And all it takes is 1 hour of lost sleep, because there is a global experiment that's performed on 1.6 billion people across 70 countries twice a year, and it's called daylight savings time.
Yeah.
And it turns out that when you look at that data, in the spring, when we lose an hour of sleep, we see a subsequent 24% increase in heart attacks as a result.
It's just incredible.
But in the autumn, when we gain an hour of sleep, we see a 21% reduction in heart attacks.
So the data's there on a global level, isn't it? Just from that.
Is striking, and you can even think, you speak a lot about, the immune system. It's so key for our health.
So tell us, what does sleep do for the immune system?
So firstly, we can look on both sides of the coin. What happens when we don't get enough sleep? Firstly, we know that people who are sleeping 5 hours a night are 4 times more likely to catch a cold than those people who are sleeping 8 hours or more.
Wow.
Striking study, very well controlled study. We also know that it doesn't take 1 week of, short sleep deprivation. 1 night is enough. What we've found is that if you take healthy individuals and then we limit them to just 4 hours of sleep for 1 single night, what we see is a 70% drop in critical anti-cancer fighting immune cells called natural killer cells, which are these wonderful sort of immune assassins that, help decrease our, cancer risk.
Yeah. And help us fight infections.
And fight infection.
Part of our innate immune system.
Exactly. Part of that critical innate immune response. Flip the sort of the side of the coin. And now what we find is that when you get sleep, there is a change in what we call the autonomic nervous system, which is sort of this automatic part of our nervous system. And that automatic nervous system is split into 2 branches. One that is sort of like the accelerator pedal that gets us revved up, triggers the fight or flight response. The other is the brake that sort of calms us down. And when we go into deep sleep, we apply that brake to the nervous system and everything quiets down. Heart rate decreases. Deep sleep is the most wonderful form of natural blood pressure medication that you could ever wish for.
Yeah.
But one of the other things is that we see as that nervous system quiets down, levels of things like cortisol drop down, that stress-related chemical. And it's during that time that the body goes into an immune stimulation mode. And it's where essentially you're going to restock the armament of your immune army so that when you wake up the next day, you can battle and fight infection. What's also fascinating, and I love this data, and this tells you just how critical sleep is to fighting for our health. If you look at people who become infected, or you actually infect them in the experimental laboratory, let's say with sort of a cold vaccine, or you immediately trigger increased sleepiness and increased amounts of deep sleep. And it turns out that the infection indicates to the immune system that you're under attack, and the immune system will actually signal to the sleep system within the brain, we need more sleep. Sleep is the best battle force that we have right now to combat this assault. And so that's why when you're sick, all you tend to want to do is just curl up in bed and go to sleep. The reason is because your body is trying to sleep you well.
It's an appropriate response to what's going on, right?
Exactly.
The bodies are pretty clever, right?
They are remarkably clever. You know, again, Mother Nature has figured this out. And so she brings up this thing called sleep, which I would argue is probably like the Swiss Army knife of health. You know, whatever ailment you are facing, it is more than likely that sleep has a tool in the box to try and help fight it.
That's so key. Whatever ailment you're facing, guys, if you're listening to this, whatever you're suffering from, whether it's a lack of energy on a day-to-day basis, or whether it's that you're worried about your risk of developing a chronic disease such as type 2 diabetes or heart problems as you get older, what Matthew is saying, what Professor Walker is saying is that sleep, improving your quality of sleep, is going to help you with all these different facets. It's going to help reduce your risk. It's going to help increase your energy. It's also going to reduce your risk of actually getting disease in the future, which is just absolutely incredible. I mean, we are going to move on to tips, because I know many of you will be thinking, okay, this is all great. I'm sort of hearing about all these things that sleep does, but how do I get more? So we're going to come to that shortly. But so many health inequalities are there from people from different socioeconomic groups. We know in the UK that you can have as much of a 10-year difference in your life expectancy depending on where you live. One thing I like about a focus on sleep, and I appreciate that there are many pressures in deprived communities, financial stresses, maybe a lot of shift work, maybe working multiple jobs.
That's
so
right.
I absolutely understand and recognise that there are significant issues that we have to overcome. But a lot of the recommendations that we're now going to talk about, that I cover in my book and you cover in detail in your book, most of the recommendations to help people to, get more quality sleep are free of charge.
Yeah, I often say that I think sleep is perhaps the most democratically freely available healthcare system for everyone around the world. Now, that's a bit of a glib statement on the basis of exactly what you just said, I think about, and the data is quite frightening. We've been looking at this too, at sort of low socioeconomic status communities, and there what you'd see is just what you described, higher general social stress that impairs sleep, usually working multiple different jobs, split shifts, working the night work. Often people in those communities are working in the service industry. That usually means that you're either up very early or you're staying in work very late, all of which comprise, factors that work against sleep. So I want to be really appreciative of that.
Yeah, me too.
But still, I think, the tips that we can do right now to start sleeping better every night should be applicable and for the most part utilized by just about everyone, as long as you don't have a sleep disorder.
Well, Matthew, normally I end the podcast off by asking people for 4 key tips that people can put into practice immediately, but we don't have to limit it to 4. I want this podcast to inspire people to not only take sleep seriously, but to give them some practical help. So immediately after listening to this, I can put the headphones down and go, right, I'm going to do what Professor Walker's asked me to do. I'm going to try these 5 things today. In your experience, and you've been interviewed all around the world now to do with your book, what are those common things that people aren't doing that they could do to help improve their sleep?
Yeah, so there's probably maybe 5 things that people can do right now to get better sleep. The first is regularity. Going to bed at the same time and waking up at the same time, no matter what. Even if you've had a bad night of sleep, still try to wake up at the same time. Just understand it's going to be a tough next day, and then get to bed at the same time that following night, and you'll have a good night of sleep. You'll sort of sleep a little bit more soundly that night. Even if it's the weekday or the weekend, don't do what we call social jet lag, which is sort of where you sort of sleep too late at the weekend, and then on Sunday night you've got to drag your body clock all the way back and try and force it to sleep at a time when you haven't been sleeping before. That's torture. Regularity is key. The second thing is temperature. We've spoken a little bit about that, but keep your bedroom cool. Probably around about 18 degrees Celsius, which is colder than most people think. But cooling the room down takes your body into that right sort of thermal space for good sleep. It cools it down. Darkness, we've spoken about too, but we are, I think, a dark-deprived society in this modern era. And you need darkness at night to allow the release of a hormone called melatonin, which helps time the healthy onset of your sleep. So yes, it's to do with blue light sort of emitting devices, screens, phones. Those are things that you should try and stay away from in the last hour before bed. But it's not just that. It's also overhead lighting. We don't need to be bathed in electric light all night. In the last hour before bed, just try turning half of the lights off in your flat or in your home. You'd be surprised at how soporific and sleepy you become when you're shrouded in darkness. So that's the third thing. The fourth thing is, I would say, walk it out. And what I mean by that is, don't stay in bed if you've been awake for 20 or 25 minutes, either trying to fall asleep or you've woken up and you're trying to get back to sleep. The reason is because your brain is this wonderfully associative device, and it will start to very quickly learn that being in bed is about being awake rather than asleep. So what you need to do is, after about 25 minutes, just relax, understand that sleep is not quite here yet, go to a different room, in dim light, read a book or listen to a podcast, but don't check email, don't eat, because it trains your brain to expect that in the middle of the night. Only return to bed when you are very sleepy. And that way your brain will start to relearn the association that your bedroom is the place of sleep rather than the place of
I think
wake.
that's a really important tip, Matthew, that, I know even from our first conversation on Facebook, but, whenever I talk about sleep, people can often get really wound up about this and say, I'm doing all those things. I can't sleep. And they've really just, without trying to, their brain has just got into this position where it's been trained not to sleep. It's been trained to not associate the bedroom with sleep. Or, so many people I see, when I hear about on social media, are doing work emails right up to the moment they fall asleep. And we mentioned children before, and I often say, children need a bedtime routine. We know that. Right? Why, as adults, do we think we're any different?
We should, and you're absolutely right. We've turned the bed in this day and age often, into a kitchen. We've turned it into an office. We've turned it into a cinema. We do all of these things typically on the bed, which then it does impact the brain's association. It gets quite confused about what this thing called the bed is all about. So I think that's a very helpful tip. And try not to get too anxious if you're sort of falling asleep. I know that probably a lot of what I've been telling people will make you feel anxious if you're not being able to get the sleep that you need. But try not to worry about it. Everyone has a bad night of sleep. Just get up, understand that you're going to be awake for a little bit longer, and then go back to bed, and you will start to relearn that association. And in fact, a lot of people and patients will say to me, well, I've been falling asleep on the settee watching television. And then I get into bed and I'm wide awake and I don't know why. And again, it's because of this association that you've learned with the bed. The final 2 things, one of which we've mentioned, is what you intake into your body, caffeine and alcohol. We've spoken about caffeine, but I'll speak about alcohol quickly. Many people use alcohol as a sleep aid, and it is anything but an assistant to sleep. alcohol is a class of drugs that we call the sedatives, and sedation is not sleep. Unfortunately,
sedation is not sleep.
It's
I love
very
it.
different. So what you're doing when you have a nightcap or you use alcohol to try and get to sleep, and many people do, understandably so, they mistake one for the other. You're just knocking your cortex out. You're not in natural sleep. The two other problems with alcohol and sleep: firstly, alcohol will fragment your sleep. So if I were to record someone's sleep in the laboratory after they've had a couple of drinks, their sleep is littered with all of these awakenings throughout the night. Now, you tend not to remember waking up, but the next day you feel, again, unrefreshed. You don't feel sort of bright and alert or restored by your sleep. But you don't remember waking up, so you don't link it to the alcohol. But alcohol is bad at fragmenting your sleep, produces poor quality. The final thing alcohol is good at doing is blocking your dream sleep or your REM sleep. And we know, to come back to our conversation, REM sleep is critical for emotional first aid. REM sleep provides overnight therapy. It's a form of emotional convalescence, and alcohol will block that REM sleep quite viciously. So those would be the 5 tips, I think, for better sleep.
Yeah, Matthew, thanks. I love that. Just to say on alcohol, is it dose dependent? So, for example, some people say, well, I'm okay with 1 glass of wine, but 2 or 3 glasses is going to fragment my sleep. Can you comment on the dosage there, or would you advise people who are struggling with sleep to knock it on its head, basically?
I know, and it's so hard for me to answer this, and this is the reason, one of the many reasons why I'm such a deeply unpopular person. But
I don't think that's fair to say. But
Firstly, I don't want to sound puritanical. Life is to be lived to a degree. And all of these things that we're discussing, we're trying to speak about the extremes. But I also want to empower people with the knowledge. I'm not here to tell you necessarily what you should or you shouldn't do. I just want to give you the scientific facts, and then you can make the choice. I would say, unfortunately, that even just 1 glass of alcohol in the evening, we can see that, we can measure that.
You can measure that in your lab. You can see that you're not getting the same deep level of restorative sleep, even with 1 drink.
Even with 1 drink. So I know it's hard, but now, everyone, should, have a social life and sort of, enjoy a drink now and again. I think the best advice would be this: if you're going to bed feeling tipsy, you probably have had too much alcohol in terms of sleep impairment.
Well, I think, I so resonate with it, with so much of what you've just said, which is, this podcast, what I do, what you do, it's not about telling people what to do. I've got no interest of telling someone what they should do. I have no right to tell someone what they should do with their lives. What I think we're trying to do is to educate people, inspire them, empower them to understand what lifestyle choices they're making and how that could impact their health. And I always draw the analogy with going out, having a few drinks with your mates on a Friday night. People know intuitively that if I go out for a drink on a Friday night and have 3 or 4 pints, let's say, you know what, my Saturday morning might be a bit of a write-off. I may not be functioning as well as I might want to. But you're going into that with that knowledge. You're saying, I know the effect alcohol has on me, but I'm going to get so much enjoyment out of my night out tonight that I'm willing to put up with the consequences. What I think we're both trying to say is, guys, we just want to empower you. We want to help you understand the impact that caffeine might be having on your sleep, that alcohol might be having on your sleep, that the fact that you're on your work emails before you go to bed might be having on your sleep. Do with that information what you will. That's how I would put it.
I so agree, because I think, a lot of, what you speak about in your book, which is, far more wide ranging than mine, because I just take one of the things, you go after 4 of the key pillars, which is so much more impressive. I think it says so much about the difference between me and you, Rangan. But
you're a researcher. I'm a clinician, right? There's a big difference, right?
There is, but I still think it's a heroic thing. But what I would say, I think, is that, yes, a lot of people are aware of some of these things, like it's good to be physically active, I should try and stay away from drinking too much alcohol. But I also think that there's a lot of what we discuss, I hope in both books, that is perhaps knowledge that people aren't aware of.
Yeah.
And if only that they were aware of it, they would actually want to do something different. That's the sort of the case that I'm really passionate about, is that people, as long as you know the information and you choose to do otherwise, no problem at all. A lot of people just are either misinformed or entirely, when it comes to sleep, uninformed. That's the goal.
That is the goal, and it's really about, it's that empowerment piece. And And this is one thing I just want to end on, is just to say, guys, look, it may not be that you can just change one thing and suddenly have a great night's sleep. You might have to change 3 or 4 things together. That's certainly my experience. It's like, Matthew, you're a researcher, so a lot, you'll do research on showing what caffeine does, on showing what alcohol does. But I would say, as a clinician, use that research, but maybe you might have to try a few things. Like you might try, for example, 1 week with no caffeine and no alcohol and see how you sleep, because then you can be empowered to decide what you're going to do after that. Are you going to go back? Or maybe then, I always try and get people sleeping as well as they've ever slept. Then they can start reintroducing some of these lifestyle things that they want. And they can say, oh, wow, that's interesting. I felt great last week, but now when I have a 2 p.m. coffee, you know what? I'm not quite as good. Okay, that's going to teach me now that I'm going to knock it a bit earlier in the day, because I think ultimately nobody's going to follow your advice or my advice simply because we told them to. I think it's only when they start to feel the difference themselves, they go, wow, I kind of like feeling good.
Yeah, and I think, I love your point about just trying to give it time too. Sleep and starting to change your sleep and seeing the effects of getting better sleep. It's a little bit like exercise at the gym. You're not going to go to the gym one day and wake up looking like Arnold Schwarzenegger. It just takes some time, but if you commit to it, you will see gradual change. And it's the same thing with sleep as well. But I also think I love the idea of you putting sleep in that bedrock place and then starting to introduce the other factors. What's lovely is that many of them will actually fall in place when sleep is stabilized. And I'll give you a good example of diet. We know that without sufficient sleep, 2 critical appetite hormones go in opposite bad directions. One of those hormones is called leptin, which is a hormone that sort of signals to your body you're full, you don't want to eat anymore. The other hormone is called ghrelin, which does the opposite. It says you're not satisfied with your food, you want to eat more. And despite leptin and ghrelin sounding like 2 hobbits, they are actually real hormones. What's interesting is that when you sleep deprive people, or even just limit them to maybe just like 5 or 6 hours of sleep for a week, levels of leptin, which say you're full, don't eat more, they drop down. Levels of ghrelin that ramp up your hunger and say, I've just eaten a big meal, but I'm not satisfied, I want to eat more. That hormone skyrockets when you're underslept. So no wonder people who are sleeping just 5 to 6 hours a night will actually eat on average somewhere between 200 to 300 extra calories every single day.
Yeah,
so you can solve sleep and you will actually start to not want to eat as much.
Yeah, and this is why a part of weight loss is to sleep better. I know you're on a really busy schedule. That's what happens when you have such a popular international best-selling book.
Well, and you know all about that too. So.
Well, guys, I'd highly encourage you to pick up Matthew's book, Why We Sleep. It's absolutely brilliant. It's got pretty much everything you've ever wanted to know about sleep. I think you'll probably find in that book. I look forward to when you release a later edition, when you've got newer research coming out in the future at some points. But Matthew, one question I like to ask my guests who are, leading researchers in the field is, as you became more and more aware of all this sleep research, what was the biggest thing in your own lifestyle that you changed on the back of your research?
I think it was probably caffeine. I think just seeing the data and then doing those types of studies ourselves, and particularly the finding that we discussed where even if you're asleep, the quality of that sleep is just not as deep. That really got me concerned, and that's when I really started to pay attention to my caffeine content.
And are you teetotal now with caffeine, or are you?
So right now, yeah, I am. I drink decaffeinated tea and I drink decaffeinated coffee. I sometimes, I've ebbed and flowed between sort of having coffee in the morning because I do feel it's alerting benefits, but we didn't necessarily evolve to be medicated with caffeine. And I think anyone who's, drinking caffeine at 11 a.m., which on the basis of your circadian rhythm, if you listen to the wonderful podcast with Sachin Panda that you did, your peak of your circadian rhythm is right around sort of the 11 o'clock period. That's when it should be almost impossible for you to fall asleep. But yet, I sometimes look around on an airplane when I'm leaving and half the plane is asleep at 11 o'clock.
Yeah.
And if you're self-medicating your sleep deprivation at 11 a.m. with caffeine, it usually means that you're perhaps just not getting enough sleep. And that's probably been one of the greatest, I think, influential factors. That and the impact on my productivity, I think that was the most underrated. And it actually forced me to start doing a lot of research on sleep loss and productivity that maybe on a second podcast we can talk about.
We can get into, yeah.
But, my ability to maintain focus and produce high-quality output work is dramatically dependent on the sleep that I've been having at night.
That absolutely echoes what Professor Panda said a few weeks ago on this podcast. When he goes off caffeine, his productivity goes up. So guys, look, no one's asking you guys to cut out caffeine. I know how much you guys love it. I have certainly had my own love-hate relationship, well, more love of a relationship with coffee in the past, but I have dramatically reduced it and I'm feeling better than I've ever felt. Are some people just lucky? They're born with good genes, so they're going to age well. Or do all of us have the opportunity to do things that are going to increase the likelihood that we can also age well?
Well, all is a strong word. If you've got a genetic disease that's fatal and it comes up early, I mean, there's often nothing you can do about that. But for the vast majority of us, genetics is not a prescription. It's not deterministic. It's probabilistic. It's like quantum physics. It's a statistical tendency that you might be prone to cancer or alcoholism or heart disease or living a long, healthy life. And the choices that we make in 3 areas can really, there's a whole lot that's still under our control. Genes make up, depending on the trait or quality you're looking at, they make up between 7 and 50% of the variability in outcomes. That leaves a whopping amount that's under our control. And it's basically things like mindset, healthy practices, and then luck. If you get hit by a bus and you get a concussion, no matter how careful you were, that could happen and that will change things. I'm curious to know what conversations you have with your patients. As you know, I'm not a medical doctor. I'm just a simple country neuroscientist. So do you talk about quality of life, and are there trade-offs in your patients where you have to say, well, look, you can do this. If you do this, it'll make you live happier, but maybe not as long?
Yeah, look, I talk with my patients about a whole variety of different things. So, typically people will be in to see me with a specific problem. So I wouldn't say that many people are coming in saying, hey, doc, what can I do to enhance and optimize my longevity? You do get it a couple of times, but it's not that common. So typically the attention goes to what is that person suffering from? Now, my bias is that we over-medicate in medicine. We suppress symptoms a lot, and that often if we're careful with lifestyle interventions, you can make big changes, not just in terms of prevention, in terms of preventing getting sick, but often when people are sick, it can make a massive improvement in their symptoms. And, sometimes, you can reverse things, but I'm talking about giving patients a sense of agency over how they feel.
Absolutely.
Which I think is really important. I think certainly in almost 20 years of practice, I'd have to say that when a patient feels as though they can't do anything, like they've just got this condition and there's nothing they can do about it, I just see, you don't see that good outcomes there. People feel very disengaged in the process. I always want to give people a feeling that they can do something about it. Even if it's 5 minutes of meditation a day, it's going to help change their perception of it. But often what I do is when I talk to them about those lifestyle changes, I'll also explain what that's going to do for them long term. So yes, it's about helping them in the short term with their symptoms, but also I'll say, well, yeah, but this can also, sleep, for example. I spoke to Matthew Walker on the podcast maybe a year ago.
He's terrific.
So. Yeah, absolutely fantastic. And me and Matthew were talking about some of the research that is suggesting that sleep deprivation, chronic sleep deprivation, can be causative
absolutely.
In the development of Alzheimer's.
Absolutely. And interestingly, there are many misdiagnosed cases of Alzheimer's where somebody's got memory impairment and they're simply sleep deprived.
Yeah, exactly. So if I had a patient who was struggling with their sleep and who also had a family member with Alzheimer's, for example, the conversation could very easily be about the things that they can do in the short term to help. But I might also bring up some of that research and say, hey, look, Alzheimer's doesn't just start, the 6 months before you get it. It's probably been going on for 20 or 30 years in your brain beforehand. And chronic sleep deprivation is one of those factors. So not only will you feel good in the short term, but you're going to help insulate yourself from potentially going down the path that your family member did. So I guess that's the context in which I might bring it up. Is that what you were getting at?
Yeah, that's terrific. Yeah, I'm really interested in that, and it sounds. I agree with you completely. If I were a medical doctor, I'd be having the same conversations.
Yeah, because it's for me, and I wonder if you subscribe to this, Dan, that it's often the things that we can do day to day that are going to help us feel good day to day are also the sort of things that are going to help us age well, right?
Yes. Although there are some funny exceptions.
What are those exceptions?
Well, my favorite example of an exception is jogging.
Okay.
There's dozens of studies now that show that for every hour that you jog, you get an extra hour of life. So if you're jogging 5 hours a week, you're going to get 5 hours added on to the end of your life. It's a pretty robust finding. But if you unpack it a bit, if you step back and you say, I love jogging, well, that's a good trade-off. You're enjoying it in the moment. If you hate jogging, like I do, I like power walking. I can't stand jogging. Why would I want to spend an hour a day now to get an hour a day later at the end of my life when I'm, possibly catatonic and drooling all over myself? It doesn't seem like the right trade-off. I'd rather have the hour now. If it was a 2-to-1 ratio, that'd be different, but it's not.
So I guess your approach is about giving people information and letting them decide what they want to do with that information.
Absolutely. In fact, that's my whole thing through the last 3 books, is that I wouldn't presume to tell anybody what to do about anything. I feel that my job as a scientist is to just lay out what I know about the science of various issues, whether it's productivity and creativity, as in the organized mind, or the science of trying to sort out what's true and what's not in the newspaper and in Facebook posts, the Field Guide to Lies and Statistics. And here, these are the trade-offs, these are the choices. You have to decide. It's a very personal thing.
Yeah, and Dan, it's interesting. You're saying that as a neuroscientist, but I would echo that as a medical doctor. I actually don't believe it's my job to tell anyone what to do. In fact,
well, I appreciate that, because a lot of doctors are paternalistic.
They are, and I fundamentally believe that you don't really connect and make long-term changes with someone when you are paternalistic and you tell them what to do. I guess going back to the book, because I do think it's really interesting, and there's quite a few things in there that I think people listening to this podcast can start thinking about applying into their own life, which is ultimately, I think, the goal of you sharing that information with people. It's, yes, to educate them, but it's also to hopefully empower them to think, hey, I could start doing that, right? So let's actually go into the sort of granular, the nitty-gritty of what it is. What is the number one thing people can do to help ensure that they age well?
The number one factor that influences how you're going to fare at any age is a personality trait, a mindset, you might call it, of conscientiousness. That swamps all other factors in terms of whether you're going to be healthy and happy at age 8 or age 108. Now, think about it. Conscientious kids don't cross against the light, so they're less likely to get hit by a lorry. Conscientious teenagers and adults are less likely to end up in prison because they follow some marginal rules. Conscientious adults go see a doctor when something's wrong. They say, it hurts here, and then, well, conscientious adults have a doctor, and they, at least in the U.S., their insurance payments are current, and when the doctor tells them to do something, they do it. Conscientiousness, which is a cluster of traits relating to stick-to-itiveness, reliability, dependability, doing what you'll say you'll do, that's the biggest single factor. And although it's unevenly distributed throughout the population. Some people have a lot of it, some people have none. And on the one extreme, if you've got too much of it, it becomes obsessive compulsive disorder, compulsive hand washing or things like that. You can change that as well as any personality trait or mindset quality at any age. It's never too early to start, and it's never too late to start.
Yeah, and that's super interesting, because when you talk about personality, because you're basically saying the number one factor that predicts if you're going to age well is how conscientious you are.
Yeah.
And some people will hear that and think, oh my God, I'm not that conscientious a person. So that number one factor that Dan said, and Dan, that neuroscientist said, I don't have it. But what you're then saying is that you can change your personality.
Well, you can. The whole field of psychotherapy is based on this idea. And although not all psychotherapeutic techniques work for all people, there's a bunch of studies coming out about behavioral change. Just to take one example, cognitive behavioral therapy has been shown to be better at improving symptoms of depression and lack of conscientiousness. And this CBT is not you lying on a couch and talking about your childhood and the relationship with your mother. It's practical tools that the therapist gives you to help you reach the goals you said that you wanted to reach, sort of like your patients coming to you. CBT doesn't tell you what to do. They tell you how to do it. And it's been shown to be more effective than drugs, even antidepressants. And interestingly, perhaps counterintuitively, CBT alone is more effective than the combination of drugs and CBT. But it's not just therapies, meditation, yoga, finding inspiration from literature or art, or somebody that you've read about in the news who has made a change, maybe somebody in your family, and saying, I'm inspired by that, I'm going to do that.
Super interesting, isn't it? That conscientiousness is that number one trait. And that it's something that you can train or work on, certainly.
At any age.
At any age, which is very encouraging. Now, when you were describing conscientiousness, I was thinking, okay, so someone is conscientious, they're going to wait for the green man to cross the road, they're going to go and see the doctor when they're sick. Are you talking about someone then who just follows rules? Because I guess, and I've read your previous book, and I know you talk a lot about creativity. And, there's so many benefits to being creative and, I guess, challenging a lot of the assumptions that are already there in society and actually, sort of navigating your way around that. Is there a clash there somewhere? Can you be someone who is highly conscientious, but is also very creative and willing to challenge things?
Well, I believe so.
Do you see what I'm getting at?
I do, yeah. Because conscientiousness, although rule following is a part of it, it's not all of it.
Yeah.
And there are cases where you really have to not follow a rule. If you're starving and you see a roll, really starving, you're about to die, and you see a roll left out on a table in a restaurant that hasn't been picked up yet, I would say you're morally and ethically justified to pick up that roll, even though you didn't pay for it. There are all these kinds of thought experiments about ethics. I think that if you had the opportunity to murder Hitler, murder is supposed to be against the rules, but there's an argument to be made that would have been a good thing to do. So, and these aren't, I'm not talking about creative acts here. I'm talking about more practical ones. But I think of the people I know, Joni Mitchell's a good example, one of the most creative people I know. And she's very conscientious, although she breaks all kinds of rules with her songwriting and her painting. She's a wonderful painter. The way the conscientiousness shows up is she finishes what she starts. She'll spend months working on a single line of a song to get it just right. That's a kind of stick-to-itiveness. And she's happy to break rules in songs. For one thing, she doesn't use standard guitar tunings like everybody else does. She invents her own. Interestingly, this is not well known, but the reason she did it is because she had polio as a child. She doesn't have I can tell you this because you're a guitarist, she doesn't have the full strength of her left fingers to be able to make conventional chords. For the most part, she can only play 2 strings at once, kind of like Django Reinhardt. So she invents these tunings that allow her to basically take 2 fingers and move them up and down the neck. I would say that's an interesting case of rule breaking and conscientiousness.
Yeah, I mean, it's super interesting. That reminds me of, I don't know if you heard of a band called Crowded House.
For sure, Neil Finn.
Yeah,
I love
Finn.
Crowded House.
Yeah, they were one of my favorite bands in the 90s.
Yeah.
I've seen them a few times play.
Don't dream it's over.
Yeah.
There is reason within.
Yeah, exactly.
There is reason without.
It's such a great track.
Yeah. My friend Mitchell Froome plays the organ on it, the B3 organ.
Oh, really?
Da 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 da.
Yeah, I know well.
It's amazing.
This conversation could fast go down a track of music, which I'm going to go down for a little bit because I'm super interested. The B3 is one of my favorite sounds. I think out of all musical sounds, I absolutely love it. And when it's just sitting there in the background, it's just beautiful.
And I think that Mitchell managed to get it as close to the timbre and the sound of Booker T.
Yeah.
Booker T. Jones. I think he managed to get that sound, the Booker T sound, Green Onions and all that. And it's hard to do. It's all in the drawbars and it's in the micro adjustments you make with touch.
Yeah.
But man, he nailed it.
It's, yeah. I mean, and on Crowded House, what was relevant in my head based upon what we said about Joni Mitchell is that I remember seeing an interview with Neil Finn once, and he's not verbatim, but he says something like, we're a 4-piece band, so our limitations become our strength. So he was all from certainly my interpretation of what I heard was that we're going to only record stuff or play live stuff that we can do, the 4 of us. So we're going to have to create around that rather than bringing in extra people to be able to play this part or that part or that part.
It's the opposite of a latter-day Beatles or Steely Dan approach.
Yeah.
They're a live band like you too.
Yeah, exactly. And it's fascinating that Joni also, because she's got a limitation that that gives her some new creativity, because if she didn't have that, maybe she would play in standard tuning and therefore she might not be as creative. Who knows? But it's super interesting. But I guess, Dan, we are talking about aging well and the brain, and you've written a book on music and the brain. So I'm interested, does music play a role for us in terms of how we're aging?
Well, yes and no. We now believe that 5% of the population are, sorry for a buzzword, but anhedonic for music, meaning they don't get pleasure from music. And, this is just due to genetic variation or environmental factors. We see anhedonia, failure to receive pleasure, in many domains. Some people don't like chocolate. Some people don't like sex. Or being touched. Some people don't like music. But for the rest of us who do, there are some interesting connections between music and aging, some of which are well known. If you've got Alzheimer's or extreme dementia, and you no longer recognize where you are or who your friends are, you don't recognize yourself in a mirror, in many, many cases, you still recognize songs from your youth. They're preserved. And this is not just kind of a cool fact. It's an essential part of adults living with cognitive impairment in relaxing them or causing them to be less agitated. Imagine what it's like if you look in the mirror, you don't recognize who it is, you were put in some home or facility after your memory impairment started, so you don't know where you are. You don't recognize the caregivers who come in every single day. And often we see in these patients, as you well know, a great deal of agitation and anger. And of course they're angry. They don't know where they are. But you put on the headphones, the earbuds, whatever, you play them a song from when they were 14 years old. They suddenly reconnect with themselves. There's home. There's something in their memory that they recognize, and that's who I am. This is something I can get a hold of. And we find that in these cases, the patients as well as their families are tremendously relieved. Now, that's sort of an extreme case of music. A less extreme case that's not as well known is that older adults who start to learn an instrument, or if they already play a new instrument, that learning is neuroprotective. One of the many myths that I try to bust in The Changing Mind is that you can't grow new neurons after a certain age, or you can't make new neural connections. Neuroplasticity, the buzzword for making new neural connections, new synapses, that goes on your entire life. And the more you can learn, especially new things, the more neuroprotective it is, because you're building up neural and cognitive reserves. So
that could be anything though, right? You just learning anything, whether it's music or sport or
absolutely,
but is
a new language.
So this sounds like one of the key things we need to be thinking about as we get older is keep trying new things.
Yeah, and in particular, there's this new appreciation for what we call embodied cognition. Barbara Tversky and Scott Grafton both have new books out about this. Scott's is called Physical Intelligence. Fantastic books. The idea is that your body actually helps your mind grow through the experiences you have manipulating your body. So learning a new language is neuroprotective, but learning something that involves eye-hand coordination, musical instruments being one, not so much singing, but playing an instrument, or taking up tennis or ping pong, or anything that involves this kind of body intelligence. Very powerful is simply going for a walk on an uneven trail. As you probably know, some Scottish doctors are now writing prescriptions for their patients. Go for a walk outside. It's because as you're walking on an uneven surface, your foot and your ankle and your legs and your vestibular system are making dozens of micro adjustments every minute. You have to change the pressure and the angle, and you have to get feedback about what's happening so you don't fall over. And it's hugely important.
So would you say that, would you therefore not be recommending as people age that they work out in a gym, on a treadmill, or on an exercise bike? Or can you do a bit of both?
Well, you can certainly do a bit of both. I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, I've changed a few things in my own life. One was I didn't know about sarcopenia. How would I? As I say, I basically know about stuff from the chin up and a little bit of spinal cord. But sarcopenia is to muscle what osteoporosis is to bone. And so I've started doing resistance training. I go to the gym. I'm not trying to bulk up like Arnold Schwarzenegger, but I do a round of 12 different weight machines just to keep my muscles going. I spend about 40 minutes there 4 or 5 times a week. Jane Fonda has told me she started doing the same thing.
Do you enjoy it?
I do. I couldn't tell you why, but I do. And I also do the elliptical because I'm trying to get my heart rate up, and I do what's called high intensity interval training. But better than both of those really is the difference between sedentarism and moving outdoors. If you only do one thing, you should move outdoors. But yeah, adding the others is great.
Yeah. I mean, that's great because there's a lot of information we're giving people, and sometimes getting too many things to do, too many things that are great to do, can sometimes seem a bit overwhelming.
You have to prioritize. Now, if you're in a wheelchair, get somebody to take you out. The visual stimulation of being in nature is neuroprotective, not as much as if you're walking. And if you can push your own wheelchair, even better, or walker.
Yeah. Now, Dan, you've got a long history in music, haven't you? You're a music producer as well?
Yes.
Yeah. And I heard you on an interview recently talk about you had the opportunity to meet Sting once and you scanned his brain.
Yeah.
So I'm interested, Sting, I don't know how old Sting is, but
he's a few years older than me. I'm 62. I think he's 67-ish.
Yeah. So look, I haven't seen a picture of Sting for a while, but the last time I saw him, certainly there's no way I would have guessed that he was in his late 60s. It's clearly someone who seems to be aging very well. So Sting has a lot of practices, certainly that come across in the media that we read about. How many of those are true? That I don't know. But when
the tantric sex is not true, for example.
It's not true?
No.
Okay. Do you know what he does?
I do. Sting had read This Is Your Brain on Music, and he reached out to me at some point in 2007 or 8 and said he wanted to visit the lab and meet me and talk about the findings. And so he came to Montreal, and I said, while you're here, if you want, we can scan your brain and we can, see what it looks like. It wouldn't be an actual study. I guess it's a case study, but not a proper experiment. And he was into it. And, we found that his corpus callosum is thicker than most people's. That's the fiber tract that connects the left and the right hemisphere. And we often see thicker corpus callosi in people who are very creative, who are shuttling information from the left to the right hemisphere. We learned some things about how he organizes music in his memory that were quite novel. We published a paper about it, Scott Grafton and I, the embodied cognition guy, in a journal called Neurocase. It's available for free on my website, as all my peer-reviewed papers are.
Okay, great. And we'll link to all of them as well in the show notes section so people can easily find that.
It is an article written for other scientists, but I think that the average person could glean the punchline from it. And then we kind of got along. We got along well, and he invited me to come and tour with him and the Police reunion tour for a few shows.
You got to be kidding me!
It was terrific.
Oh wow!
And so I did get to see what his life is like. He does yoga every afternoon. He has, for at least a couple of hours, sometimes 4. He earmarks alone time apart from the yoga to either practice something musically or learn a new song or write something just to experiment around. He gives himself time to play every day when he's on tour. And then the other extraordinary thing was, we were talking about conscientiousness. I've never met anybody with the work ethic that he has. And, I'm a professor. I know a number of Nobel Prize winners. Most of the professors I know are workaholics. We work 75, 80 hours a week. That's nothing compared to what Sting does. He is working all the time. He enjoys himself, but his work ethic, just to give you an example, I asked him, how is it that you play bass and sing at the same time? I'm a bass player. That's very difficult to do because It's not like strumming a guitar or finger picking where everything's in sort of lockstep time. Bass parts tend to be syncopated. You're not always singing when the bass hits a note. You're sometimes singing in between notes and in odd integer ratios. And so just as a demonstration of work ethic, I said, how do you do it? He says, he says, when I know that I'm going to go out on tour and I'm going to have to play these songs in the studio.
Yeah, you can track it differently.
Yeah, he played the bass first, he sang second, or vice versa. If he's going to have to do it live, so he writes out on a piece of paper the lyrics and the chords or the notes, and he writes a kind of visual map for where the vocal note is versus the bass notes. Sometimes they're synchronized, sometimes they're anti-phase. And then he'll sit down and he'll practice one measure at about 1/5 the normal tempo. And he might do that for half an hour, that one measure. And then he'll put it away and go to another song, and the next day he'll come back and he'll add another measure. And he says it could take him 6 months to work up a tune at the proper tempo. And I thought, wow. Oh my God.
Is it a bit like, again, I'm not trying to compare the two, but just to sort of make it really relevant for people at home who maybe are not musical or don't play the bass and have never tried to play the bass and sing at the same time. Like, I'm sure it's the same in America. We have this thing where you have to try and pat your stomach and, put your hand around your stomach and pat your head at the same time, which some people find quite hard to do but I think most people, when they focus on it and practice...
Well, it requires what we call limb independence.
Yeah. So is there something similar to that that's going on with Sting when he's trying to just teach him, maybe not limb independence, but, voice and hand independence?
Yeah. And we find this in a lot of activities. Flying an airplane requires limb independence. You're using both feet, you're using both hands. One of the things I did in order to adopt the advice that I gave others in the book is that I realized I had to push myself out of my comfort zone. And so I took flying lessons and studied for my private pilot's license because it is very complicated. It's not like playing drums.
So you're doing this to help you age better.
I did, yeah.
Yeah.
Because
it's a new skill and it's sort of taxing your brain. and your brain's having to fire up different neurons.
Yeah.
Is that, in a nutshell, what it is?
It's exactly that. It was taxing my brain in ways I hadn't taxed it before.
Yeah.
Not only that, but I'm terribly afraid of heights. And so it was a way for me to get some agency over my own feelings in life.
I mean, I find if we just go back to Sting for a second, what I find really interesting is you started off talking about Sting and saying that he makes sure he does some yoga every afternoon, sometimes for 2 hours, sometimes for 3 or 4 hours. He ensures that he's got some time alone.
Mm-hmm.
And then you followed that up by saying he's one of the most, if not the most productive and conscientious people you've ever had the opportunity to meet.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people, that won't make sense. It will be like, hold on a minute. How can he be conscientious and hardworking when he's got time to do yoga in the afternoon and he's got time to spend an hour by himself each day? Unless, of course, those are things that help him be productive and conscientious.
Well, it's exactly that. It's if I don't go to the gym in the morning, there's always this tension that I like you probably, I'm way behind in my work. I'll never catch up no matter what I do. And I always feel that if I take 15 minutes off, I'll fall 30 minutes behind. And so when I wake up in the morning, do I go to the gym and basically lose 45 minutes? Well, for me anyway, if I do, I gain that back later in the day in terms of productivity. I get more done in an hour of work if I've had that. And Sting must have worked out that these things help keep him on an even emotional keel and help inspire him to do his best. You know, the whole Sting story reminds me of something else that maybe your listeners will be interested in. I saw this fantastic magic trick. It was the signature trick of a guy named Glenn Falkenstein, who's passed away. And I saw it several times. And what he does is he goes into a room, you know, it's usually a concert hall or a venue. And he's on the stage and his assistant puts some silver dollars over his eyes and then wraps them with plastic and then puts on some sort of thing to block his vision even more. And then she goes out in the audience and she asks somebody to, without saying what they're doing, pull something out of their pocket or their purse or off their table and hold it up. And so I was a participant in this a couple of times. I love this trick. One time I pulled out a credit card and she says to him, okay, this person is ready. Do you know what he has? And Glenn says, well, it's a credit card. And she says, okay, what else can you tell us about it? And he says, well, it's a Visa. It's not a MasterCard or a Diners Club or an Amex. She says, what else? Can you tell us anything else? He says, well, it's the Chase Bank. And she says, okay. She says, and now I'm wondering if you can read off the numbers, the 16 digits. And he does in groups of 4. After each one, she says, keep going, or, that's right. What's next? These kinds of things. Now, I imagined that this was a super high-tech trick, that she's got a hidden camera in her hand, and the reason for all of this stuff around his eyes, that he's got some kind of a screen, or maybe he's got an earpiece and somebody is, talking into his ear. He can read off the serial number of a dollar bill. People pull out a lipstick. He can tell you it's an Estee Lauder and it's this color, and it's amazing. And so right before he retired, I asked him how he did the trick. And of course, magicians aren't supposed to tell you, but he had retired. He worked on that trick with his assistant for 5 years. Everything she says is code. When she says, this person's ready, that means it's a credit card. She says, are you ready to start? That means it's a bill of some sort. If she says, okay, let's go, that means it's a piece of silverware. It's the most elaborate code you can imagine. And they memorized it. It took them 5 years of working on this 2 hours a day. But in the end, to me, it's a marvel of conscientiousness and work ethic. But in the end, they had this amazing trick that nobody can figure out.
I mean, it's incredible to hear that. And it's incredible to hear the capacity of the human brain. It's incredible to hear that story, Sting's story, and just think how hard and how dedicated some people are to mastering their craft. And then I'm always thinking about, how can I bring that back to someone who's out on a run at the moment, who's listening to this, who maybe like the title of the podcast, thought, oh, how I'm going to age well. And then what can they take from that into their own life? And I guess it's, as you said right at the start, you know, the number one trait that's going to help you age well is conscientiousness. So I guess, can you finish a task you started?
And not only that, but can you do the best possible job you can? Can you do not just good enough? Can you try to push yourself to do more, to do better? Can you grow in whatever it is that you're doing? If it's keeping a garden, if it's cooking for yourself and your family, if it's choosing vegetables, learning which ones to choose at the market so you get the most flavorful and healthy ones with the most nutrients. Any area of a human endeavor where you can learn and keep learning is what's neuroprotective. And I mean,
it's fun.
It is fun, yeah. It's curiosity, really, which is a separate trait. It's number 2 on the list after conscientiousness.
Is it really?
People who are curious do better in life.
So conscientiousness and curiosity, the 2 C's of aging well.
Right. And, you know, with this book, like all my other books, the version of it that got published was roughly version 52. That is, I wrote the manuscript, I went back over it and rewrote it entirely 52 times. I've never published anything that I had fewer than 12 revisions on. And those tend to be short articles or scientific papers where it's, there's a formula. But for the books or for the New Yorker articles or things like that, it's always 40 or 50 drafts. And I have this friend named Mike Langford, who is the best writer I know. He published a wonderful book that I think you'd like called Life in Double Time.
Okay.
About his early years as a drummer in a touring band that nobody's ever heard of, but it's hilarious and insightful. And then he wrote another book, which is both of the 2 of my favorite books of all time. The other one is Becoming Leonardo. It's a biography of Da Vinci. It's so much better than Walter Isaacson's bio, which came out at the same time. And I said to Mike, your books are so amazing. How many drafts for Becoming Leonardo? He said 75. Yeah. He worked on it 10 years. That's a masterpiece. It couldn't be any better. I have much to learn.
And I guess all of these stories, whether it's your friends there or yourself, just the act of you writing this book, forget about your other ones for a minute, just this book and doing 52 or so revisions, that is conscientiousness, that is dedication, that is actually, I guess, helping you to age well.
Well, and it's curiosity. I'm curious to know what I can do to make it better. I'm curious to know if there's after our conversation, I'm going to go take notes because I get a chance between now and the paperback to do another few revisions. Yeah. And in stimulating conversations like this, I always think, well, there's probably something I can take and change it for the better. And
it's interesting. I mean, as we record this, Dan, I mentioned just before we went on air, my 100th episode of this podcast is probably gone live whilst we've been chatting.
Congratulations.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. It's going to be something that started off as an idea just over 2 years ago.
100.
Yeah, episode 100 goes
one
out.
A week.
Pretty much one a week. I have taken August off the last 2 years because, for me, I've got 2 young kids. They're off in August. I want to just switch off and be able to spend proper quality time with them when they're off school. So, I've done that the last couple of years. But what's interesting for me is the feedback we get, the way it's grown so rapidly, and the fact that people say, "Look, each week there's such varied guests. I'm learning new things. It's making me think about my life in a different way. I can't wait for the next one. I'm really curious for what's coming next." So I guess I'm thinking, or I'm certainly hoping, that actually people who listen to this podcast each week with that curiosity maybe in some way this is helping them to age well.
Oh, I hope so. I believe so. If you can remain curious and learn new things, that's neuroprotective.
Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying this conversation, there's loads more like it on my channel. Please do press subscribe and hit that bell. Now, back to the conversation. You said that dementia is not a disease of old age.
That's right.
It's so important for people to get that because, I've spent a lot of time with Professor Dale Bredesen in California. I'm sure you've seen some of Dale's work and some of his research. And, he's said on many occasions that, Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia may be starting even 30 years before it shows up. Now, you may or may not agree with that, but he's sort of said that the idea being that when you get symptoms is not when this starts. This starts
That's right.
long way before. And therefore, there's an opportunity, if we're aware of that, to start taking preemptive and preventive action, in our 30s, in our 40s, in our 50s,
right.
not when we're suddenly getting the diagnosis at the age of 72, let's say. So I want to just hammer home that the things in your book that are based absolutely in science in terms of what people can do, they're kind of relevant to everyone, particularly women, I would say no matter what your age, right?
I agree with you. I completely agree on everything you said. Alzheimer's disease is not like you just all of a sudden catch a cold, right? It's not like tomorrow you go to the doctor and boom, you have Alzheimer's disease. There's something that's been happening in your brain for a really, really long time that eventually leads to the symptoms, which again speaks to how resilient the brain is, how strong these brains we have are, because they can literally fend off a whole amount of pathology and insults and problems for years and years and years. And your ability and your brain's cognitive reserve, right, against these insults is really largely based on the way you live your life. There is a genetic component. Our DNA is part of whoever we are, everything we are. It's involved in every bodily and neurological function. However, your medical report card and your lifestyle matter just as much for the vast majority of people. Like even in patients with genetically determined Alzheimer's, even for those very rare patients who carry genetic mutations that cause Alzheimer's at a young age, there's evidence that things like exercise can really delay the onset of dementia. And for the vast majority of the population, over 98% of people do not carry those genetic mutations. So risk is really more about the interplay of factors like, sure, there are genetic risk factors, your genes are important, but your lifestyle is just as important, your environment is just as important, your medical health is just as important. And those are the things that we need to take care of pretty much as soon as we're aware that they're important. It's not like you're 50 and today you have to take care of your brain. No, this brain health should really be part of overall health. We should really start thinking about our brains as our best friends and the part of us that needs nurturing and supporting, that is doing so much for us, right? So I think it's really important that we make choices that really support the brain. And I usually like to say that I encourage everyone to think of their brains more like a muscle, right? There are things that you can do to make your brain stronger. You can exercise it properly, you can feed it properly, you can take care of it properly, and your brain will perform so much better for you at any age. Really at any age.
Yeah, I mean, I want to sort of get into this lifestyle piece because there's so much that people can do, particularly the bit on movement as well, where less might be more for women, which I found really interesting and something I've been thinking about for some time as well. Before we do that, I wonder if we could deal with hormones and in particular HRT, which is obviously a very hot topic. It's a very divisive topic.
Very.
From you as a neuroscientist looking through the lens of the brain and with all the work you've done, what are your views on hormones and how they can be used to help brain health?
My views are that hormones are important, and that the field has not developed the way that one would hope, especially as far as our brains are concerned. And I could talk about this for days to just give you the full detailed picture, but I think the bottom line is that preventing Alzheimer's or minimizing the depression and anxiety is not the same as treating hot flashes, right? So we know that hormonal replacement therapy is very effective at reducing, minimizing, and in some cases completely eliminating hot flashes for women who can tolerate the medication. Some women are not eligible for hormonal therapy for menopause, but most women are. And that is something that has been shown to be successful for. Like HRT can really help with hot flashes, with osteoporosis, with vaginal dryness, especially for women who undergo a hysterectomy or oophorectomy, which is the surgical removal of the uterus and or the ovaries. Now, when it comes to brain health, things become really complicated because the research is just not there. There have been clinical trials that looked at whether or not hormonal therapy could prevent dementia, right? And they showed that it cannot in women older than 65. So they were looking at women who were like 15 years post-menopause, and they were given hormones at that point, which is too late. It's just too late to start. Now, more recently, 2 very large clinical trials tested the efficacy of hormonal therapy in women who were a little bit younger, so within 5 years of menopause, and they showed no adverse effects, but also no benefit for cognition. And I would argue that that is, again, too late. We were talking about the lock and the key in the lock, the analogy. And the timeline is very important, because what happens in physiology is that this system where the hormone locks to the receptor is really age dependent. What happens to the receptors is that if you don't have hormones locking for a really long time, the receptor shuts down. It just closes. The lock is no longer a lock. It just turns into a piece of door. So if you try to give the hormones then, nothing is ever going to happen, right?
Yeah.
You need to have plasticity. You need to have the hormones and the receptors. If the receptors said, okay, sorry guys, too late, there's no point giving hormones. So what we're trying to do right now is to better clarify this window of opportunity for brain health. And the way that we need to do it is not just by theoretically putting women in a clinical trial, but we need to look at their brains. We need to probe the system. Are these receptors working or not? Are they active or not? Does it make sense to give you hormones at this stage in your life as a woman?
Yeah.
So I think this is missing, and it's hard for me to answer the question without the right information. Right now, the question is, we don't know. Maybe for some women, especially women, again, who do receive hysterectomies and oophorectomies prior to menopause, the current recommendation is to take hormones.
Yeah.
Because that's been associated with a lower risk of Alzheimer's disease, a lower risk of osteoporosis, of hot flash, a lot of symptoms. For other women, the answer is that we don't quite know yet.
So a couple of things there. So again, I don't want to quote Professor Bredesen because he's not here, and so I want to make sure I'm accurately describing some of his work. But Dale very much takes a multi-pronged approach when he's trying to help a patient. So he is saying, he would try and change 7, 8, 9 different factors together, rather than typically it's, we'll try this one thing. Does it work? No, that's shown. It doesn't work. We'll try something else. And again, there's pros and cons of things, but I quite like that method in terms of it's not about trying to put everything onto one thing. It's doing multiple things. And I think he was the first person who really tuned me into thinking, maybe 6 years ago or so, that, maybe women should be, well, not women should be, maybe some women would benefit from taking estrogen in some form through and after the menopause to not to withdraw that sort of trophic support to the brain. And I found that really interesting because, you know, as a husband, I was thinking, oh, well, when my wife gets to that stage,
it's gonna be rough.
No,
I know you were worried about.
No. Oh, genuinely, it was more. Oh, once you know that, you can't unknow it, right? So then it's like, well, should women be routinely taking that, or should we be considering that with respect to brain health?
Right.
And then, you know, where I get conflicted in my head is that, you know, we've looked through the evolutionary lens before about what men and women used to do when our brains were evolving. So I don't know if you're familiar with any work on this. I'm not. You know, if you go to something like the Hadza tribe in Tanzania, for example, hunter-gatherer tribe who are still living their traditional lifestyles, right? In terms of their hunting, their gathering, they're very much living these low stress lives that are out in harmony with nature. I wonder, you know, do they have a word for the menopause? Do they suffer menopausal symptoms in the same way?
Right.
Is it, you know, I don't know. I wonder if you've come across that at all, because I think that would be really interesting.
It is really interesting. And we do know that the experience of menopause really changes a lot depending on different cultures. Like in Asia, women do not report nearly as much discomfort as women in the United States of America. So I think, yes, there's a genetic component, but I think the lifestyle.
Stress must be, right? You know,
stress is huge. Yes.
You know, and I want to dive into this, but this is probably a good time to get into stress.
Yeah.
I can say this is not a scientific trial, but in my clinical experience, a lot of my female patients who come in with significant menopausal symptoms also have high degrees of stress in their life. Now, of course,
makes sense to me.
It could be that the symptoms are getting bad and are not getting treated, which causes a stress. I absolutely recognize that.
Yeah.
But when I've really tried to unpick lifestyles for a number of years before it, stress seems to play a really big role. And I think, as you've explained in the book with the pregnenolone steal, you know, there is a way that stress literally impacts and changes this kind of symphony of hormones in your body. So I wonder if you could expand a bit on stress and what that does to the brain.
Sure. So stress can literally steal your hormones. And that's because cortisol, which is the main stress hormone, is in balance with your estrogens. Because the body uses the same molecule, pregnenolone, which you mentioned before, to make cortisol and the sex hormones. So if you're super stressed out, like chronically stressed, your body will necessarily have to shift production of cortisol by taking the pregnenolone away from your sex hormones. And then you're going through menopause, or perimenopause, you're stressed out because you're a middle-aged woman with most likely a job, a family, elderly parents, you have no time for yourself, you're having hot flashes, or you're not feeling well because of hormonal changes. And then you also have the stress in your life and your hormones are going down further. So it really kind of turns into a vicious circle, right? Where the more stressed you are, the more symptoms you get. And who knows how we can stop it. But I think sometimes hormonal therapy might be a gateway to break the cycle. Sometimes more about lifestyle. You know, there are things that we all can and should do to keep stress at bay. And that is so important, not just for hormones, but also really for brain health, because something we don't talk about enough, I think, as a society, is that too much stress is not only bad for your heart, it's also literally bad news for your brain. And there's this incredible study came out last year with hundreds, probably thousands of people who got brain scans, and they were middle-aged, like 40 to 65. And what they showed is that if you have high cortisol levels, that really correlates with brain shrinkage already in midlife and with a worsening in memory performance. So high stress can really negatively impact your ability to recall information already when you're 50 years old. And what I thought was particularly scary is that the brain shrinkage, when they actually looked at gender, they found out that the brain shrinkage was only found in women who were post-menopause. Which is, again, the gender bias. They didn't look at gender as a predictor. They were trying to remove the effects of gender, but then they realized that there was something really hard to get rid of. Yeah. And it turns out that it was the fact that only women and not men, only highly stressed women show brain shrinkage.
I mean, this is massive. You're basically saying that stress affects the brains of women differently than the brains of men.
That's right. It looks like men's brains are more resilient to stress, at least in midlife. And again, these studies are all the average, right? We're comparing the average man to the average woman. It tells you nothing about outliers and women who can tolerate stress beautifully and men who really suffer. But on average, women's brains tend to shrink in midlife when your stress levels are really high.
And when you say midlife, are you specifically talking about
65.
What was that, sorry?
40 to 65.
40 to 65. So yeah, coming into that age of the perimenopause, I guess, and beyond.
Yeah.
I guess that really begs the question for me. And I have, men and women of all ages listening and watching this show. But if that really is the case, then in some ways that turning point to 40 is quite a significant one, in the sense of, look, of course it's going to be different in different people. And of course, these are just generalities, and it's, we can't say it's the same for everyone.
Right.
But it's almost like saying, hey, look, between your 20s and 40s, while you're building up life, figuring out who you are, what you want to be, tolerating all these kind of stressors, maybe there needs to be, again, like a step change in the way we view stress, particularly, let's say, for women at the age of 40, and go, hey, look, maybe I could get away with it 20 to 40, but over the next 10, 20 years, I've got to be careful that I take some time for myself. I take some time to switch off, that I don't take on too much. And I know it's hard because culture is pushing us away from this. And I think that's another big piece of the puzzle here, which we sort of touched on at the start, which is, I think a lot of people have it tough in society, but I think women have got it super tough. Even in this pandemic, Lisa,
yes, we do.
By and large, in my network, right, and the patients I've spoken to, and in my network, and if I'm honest, in my house, women have taken on the bulk of the caregiving duties, the sort of childcare duties. Of course, it's not in every case.
No, for sure.
But I think that would be that I know has been incredibly stressful for many women.
For sure. We got 6 months of lockdown. I thought it was going to lose my mind. But it's hard regardless of pandemics, I think. And it's really about you being able to deal with stress, because there's always going to be something that is stressful in your life. Right now, everything is pretty much more difficult, but there's always going to be stresses for everyone. And I think it's really important to start looking at strategies to reduce stress and really make it part of our culture, which is, it's not part of our culture. Right? Yeah. Now, in some schools, kids are being taught yoga and meditation, which I think is phenomenal. I wish I had it. Yeah. I learned to meditate by myself. Actually, Dr. Rudy Tanzi taught me into that as soon as I moved to New York. And that really changed my life. I thought he was like excuse me, aren't you a scientist?
So were you skeptical? This is interesting. So as a scientist, you were skeptical.
Oh my God, of course. Yeah, for sure. Yoga. I love both, and they have an incredible beneficial impact on the health of my brain for sure. But also now we have actual clinical studies showing that they really change the functionality of your brain if you do it consistently enough and according to specific traditions or specific practices. And one practice that I describe in the book is the Kirtan Kriya, which is a form of Kundalini yoga, but it's actually a meditation that's been scientifically proven in clinical trials to improve blood flow to the brain, reduce cortisol levels, and improve memory function, specifically in women during midlife and after. And it's an 11 minutes meditation that is very, you probably are
I've done it.
familiar
Yeah.
with you're done.
I had some Kundalini yoga classes last year with my wife. Actually, we had this
Nice.
instructor would come every Friday evening. We'd do that for a while, and
that's good.
I'd do that meditation as well. It's so fascinating for me to hear the skeptical scientist.
I was so skeptical.
Is now rocking out Kundalini yoga. It's brilliant.
Yeah, I'm more into running. I'm more of a runner, but yes. I think it's fantastic, and I think there are tools that may not work for everyone, but I think there are so many different options and so many different forms. It's like exercise.
Yeah.
There's something that will work for you. It's just a matter of finding out what you enjoy, what you can do consistently over time. Because if you do it for 3 days, it's not the same as really having a regular practice. And I think a lot of people have a hard time putting in the effort with regularity.
Yeah.
But the beauty about this meditation is that it's literally only 11 minutes, 12 minutes.
And there's loads on YouTube. If people want to follow it, you can just look it up on YouTube and follow one along if people want to try it.
I
mean, Lisa, look, we've not even got into your 8 pillars yet, and I have about 10 minutes left. So I know my audience are going to love this, Lisa. We'll see what we can get through, and I might be able to persuade you for a part 2 at some point, because I really think people will enjoy this. But the things I thought, we'll get through more if we can, but I found the stuff on phytoestrogens and soy really interesting. And I don't think people on my show have heard much about that before. So I wonder if you could expand a little bit on those.
Yes. So we were talking about hormonal replacement therapy, and which makes total sense, right? So as a woman, you're losing some of your estrogens, and the idea is to replace them with estrogens that come from the outside. Now, the source of the estrogen is something that a lot of scientists are looking into, because where are these hormones coming from, right? In the very early formulations of estrogen replacement therapy, and still in some formulations today, the hormones were coming from the urine of pregnant horses, which is not attractive perhaps in some ways, but it's a very reasonable source. They have to come from something, right? So they can come from animals, or they can come from plants. And something that I find very beautiful is that estrogen or estradiol is arguably the most ancient of hormones, which means that it's shared across all living beings, plants, animals, humans, as we also are animals, but we tend to forget about. So what that means is that plants make estrogens. They're called phytoestrogens from Greek, estrogens from plants. And they are so bioactive and so easy to share across species that the estrogens made by a flower or a plant really works the same way as the estrogens made in our own body. They're just milder. The effects are milder. They're more gentle. So sometimes people wonder, and some people are looking into this right now, myself included, if a diet that includes a lot of phytoestrogens from safe sources could be a gentle replacement to hormonal therapy. And the answers from culture broadly seems to be probably yes. So where are these phytoestrogens coming from? The most abundant source is soy. And soy is very controversial. But like we were talking about before, women in Asia do not suffer the kind of hot flashes and night sweats and neurological symptoms of menopause the same way that women do here in industrialized countries. It is possible that there's a genetic component. It is possible that the high quantity of isoflavones from the soy in their diet could also make a difference. Isoflavones are a very strong source of phytoestrogens.
Yeah.
Now, soy here is different. It's polluted. It's GMO, genetically modified. Is more of an allergenic for us than for Asian populations. So that may not be the best way to think about phytoestrogens. But there are a ton of other foods that contain a different kind of phytoestrogens. They're called lignans. And those foods are perfectly safe. And they're found very often in the Mediterranean regions. And we know that women on a Mediterranean diet have a much lower risk of heart disease, heart attacks, strokes, depression, anxiety, breast cancer, and dementia than women on like a Western type diet. So there's something about this diet that seems to be quite protective and quite supportive of women's health. And the key nutrients are sesame seeds, great source of phytoestrogens, flax seeds, also a great source, dried apricots, believe it or not, for some reason, all sorts of legumes, especially chickpeas and beans, some fruits, especially strawberries, melon, cantaloupe. All these fruits and vegetables are really rich in phytoestrogens, and I have a whole list because I'm a scientist, so I have a whole table in the book with all different sources by group and their bioactivity. So I think for me personally, that's the way I eat. And I've done so much research using brain scans where we show quite clearly that if you're like a 50-year-old woman, your brain looks at least 5 years younger if you're on a Mediterranean diet. I'm going to say this again. If you're a 50-year-old woman on a Mediterranean diet, your brain looks at least 5 years younger as compared to a woman who's also 50 years old, but who's been on a Western diet for most of her life. I mean, you can see them. You can see the brain scans. You can see the way the brain doesn't change when you follow a Mediterranean style diet, and the way your brain literally shrinks at age 50 when you are on a Western style diet.
And do we know, obviously you mentioned one component, some of those foods there are obviously very prevalent in Mediterranean style diets. The term Mediterranean style diet gets misinterpreted quite a lot, and lots of people use it to make the case for different kinds of foods. And so I wonder, and I appreciate you've written a whole book, Brain Food, on different foods for your brain, which is well worth reading, and so lots of practical advice in that and lots of specific foods. But, you know, is there some general broad principles of what you're talking about when you say the Mediterranean diet?
Yes. And I think, again, it's important to say Mediterranean style diet, because otherwise it becomes really impractical. Even for me, I can't find the same foods here that I used to eat in Italy growing up. But the point is plant-centric. So vegetables and fruit and grains and legumes are really the focus of the diet. When we use condiments, they're more like unrefined vegetable oils, like extra virgin olive oil, flax oil. Flax oil is incredible for vegans. I know there are so many vegans in England, and a lot of your followers are vegan as well. I'm on and off vegan forever. Flax oil is the oil with the highest concentration of polyunsaturated fatty acids, even more than extra virgin olive oil. And one concern about veganism is that unless you take supplements, your omega-3s could be quite low, because especially the kind of omega-3s that are so important for brain health, so the DHA, because plants contain AHA that the brain needs to convert into DHA, and up to 70% is lost in the conversion. So just 1 tablespoon of flax oil is pretty much more than half of all the omega-3s that you need for the day.
Wow.
So just a tip, because I was very excited when I found out. I did a lot of research on that.
But that's a great practical tip for people.
Yes.
That's super great practical. That's something people can do right now. If they, after this podcast, they can actually order something and actually start bringing it into their diet every day, right?
Yes, it's very yellow. It tastes really nice. It's great with salads. So why not?
Fantastic.
It's a good tip. Yeah. Also, fish is a big part of the Mediterranean diet, whereas meat and dairy products are considered more like a treat, like an occasional treat. It's a very flexible diet. It's a very reasonable diet. It's not, is not in any way suggesting deprivation or food restriction, which I find very sensible as a scientist. We always talk about diversity in the diet as being real key to health.
The whole invention of cereal was one of the biggest scams propagated on humanity. I mean, when you think about it, it was Kellogg and others who wanted to take, grains and turn them into cereals. But the cereals that we're eating now are mostly sugar. They're like 75% sugar, some of them, in terms of when you look at the carbohydrate. They might have 6 forms of sugar in them. And they are what we think of, quote, as a healthy breakfast when we feed our kids. Cereal and milk is a good breakfast, but it's really toxic, and it leaves them nutritionally depleted. It makes them gain weight. It causes them to sort of probably not be able to focus and, often be hungry before lunch. So I often joke, I say I'm a cereal killer. I don't think we should be eating cereal. We need protein and fat for breakfast, not sugar.
For a family or a parent listening, Mark, who thinks, okay, I get this. I want to change how I feed my children and feed myself, but they feel it's too hard, right? They feel, I don't know where to start because this is how we've been doing things for the last 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
Dr. Hyman, tell me where to start. What would you say to them?
Well, it's like anything else. If you don't know how to do it, it's hard, right? But last night I had some friends over, and, I was busy up until they showed up, and, I threw some sweet potatoes in the oven an hour and a half before they came, let them cook. And then we made really simple salad. I made some stir-fried mushrooms and some grass-fed steak. And literally the whole thing took 15 minutes and it was super easy. So I think it's really about skill, and it's about knowledge. It's about understanding how to navigate the grocery store, navigate your kitchen, to have the right tools in place, to have things ready and easy for you. So I think it's often, we don't know the skills of how to cut vegetables, or how to shop, or how to prepare food, or how to cook. And so we really have lost these arts, and it's important for people to start to learn them back. But once you do, it's really pretty simple. And I have no problem feeding myself really well, and have for years, even in a very, very busy life. So I think in the book, I do talk about how do you make it easy, how do you make the habit stick, how do you make it affordable. And I think the messaging that we've gotten is that it's complicated, it's difficult, it's time consuming, it's expensive to eat well. And it's just not true. I mean, when you look at the data on affordability in Whole Foods, maybe it costs 50 cents more a day. Other studies show it may not cost any more at all. So I think we have to sort of understand that the propaganda of you deserve a break today, leave the cooking to us, outsourcing our cooking to corporations is killing us. And we need to take back our kitchens. They've been hijacked by the food industry, and we need to start enjoying at home. And I think, COVID has had that silver lining. A lot of people are starting to cook at home, and people are getting a little trouble because they're not necessarily thinking they want to eat healthy stuff. They want to bake, but you don't want to have that COVID-19 or the quarantine 15 pounds. You want to make sure you stay metabolically healthy, because if you don't, you're more risk for getting sick from COVID and more risk for dying. So I think we have to sort of get over this myth that it's difficult, time consuming, hard, and just understand that there are some basic skills you need to learn. And it's not hard. I mean, I had a family of 5 who lived in a trailer, disability, food stamps, never cooked a meal in their life, all seriously overweight. The father was 42 on dialysis from kidney failure because of diabetes. Type 2 diabetes at 42. And the son was, 100 pounds overweight. It was a pretty bad scene. Desperate to do the right thing, desperate to lose weight. He couldn't get a new kidney if he didn't lose the weight. So they were all struggling. And they never cooked a meal. So I said, let me not give you a lecture, but let's go to your house and let's go to shopping, and let's get some simple food. And I gave them a guide called Good Food on a Tight Budget. And we made food from inexpensive ingredients that are whole foods, right? You don't have to have a $70 grass-fed ribeye steak, but you can have, ground turkey that's organic. So we had ground turkey chili. We had stir-fried asparagus. We made a salad, roasted some sweet potatoes. They didn't have knives or cutting boards. And within a few minutes, I realized this is fun. And 2, when they ate it, they were like, this is delicious. And someone was like, do you cook like this with your family every night? And I'm like, yeah. and then I was like, I don't know what's going to happen. So I gave them the guide on how to eat well for less. And then I gave them my cookbook with some recipes. And I said, you guys can do this. And on the way home, I bought them cutting boards and knives, and I sent them to their house online. And the first week she texted me back, we lost 18 pounds. The mother lost 100 pounds in the first year. The son lost 50, gained it back. He went to work at the Bojangles, which is a bad fast food store, but then ultimately lost 138 pounds going to college, into medical school. I wrote him a letter of recommendation because of a simple meal that we cooked together that changed their lives, right? Just think about that. It's not like you need, 10 years of culinary education. Just here's how you chop things. Here's the principles of stir frying, baking, roasting. Like, it's just really simple. And it was just so powerful for me to have that insight that people don't really know. It's not a lack of desire. It's a lack of knowledge and skill. And again, it's not that hard to get those skills. So I think, we're really only one meal away from a real food revolution. Jamie Oliver really has talked a lot about this. If we can just get a couple people to cook, everything's going to change. And I agree.
Yeah, it really is something, isn't it? The skill of cooking that, until, I don't know when it was, when we probably couldn't have lived without the skill of cooking until, I don't know, 30, 40 years ago. If you couldn't cook, you didn't have access to takeaways and all these cafes to give you that food. You had to figure it out. And I do want to, I touched on this in my last book, Mark. I touched on this, the rise of the influencer and the Instagram influencer. And again, nothing wrong with that at all. But sometimes I feel that people who don't know how to cook and they're a bit scared and a bit intimidated, and then they follow food influencers and they see this gorgeous meal that is picture perfect. So we think they just whip that up in their kitchen. We don't realize that, a lot of food photography, is set up over 2-3 hours to actually get all the lights right. So it actually, looks the right way. And then they think that their standard leg of lamb, broccoli and potatoes is like somehow a failure compared to what they see around them. So there's that myth to sort of bust as well, I think.
Absolutely. It's so funny that it is, listen, if you want to be a 5-star chef, fine, a Michelin chef. I'm not looking for that. I'm looking to make simple ingredients into delicious food. And it just doesn't have to be hard. It just doesn't have to be hard. It's if you get real food and good ingredients, the food itself just tastes good. I just made a beet salad. I just took and beets aren't that expensive. I just cut the beets, boiled them, chopped them up, and then put in like olive oil, lemon, dill, parsley, cilantro, salt and pepper. It was just a delicious beet salad. It's super simple. And the beet greens, I chopped them up, stir fry them with little onions and ginger, and had this beautiful, beet green side dish of cooked greens. And it's easy. Like, it's just, you don't need fancy recipes. I mean, I've written 5 cookbooks, but like, honestly, it's like, I don't really use a recipe book. It's just, once you learn it's like learning the scales. Once you're a musician, you've gotten really good at the scales, you can play anything, right? So I think that's sort of how it works with cooking as well.
Man, we're having this conversation at my dinner time, Mark, and you talking about those foods. I can feel my stomach juices just. I know you've just woken up. It's morning time, but I'm getting super hungry as you say that. So
me too. I'm like it's breakfast time.
It is breakfast time. But you mentioned COVID, and looking after your diet and the way you live was important. 18 months ago was very, very important already. Mm-hmm. It's almost been heightened in the last 12 months in terms of what we're seeing around the world. And in some ways, this could be the biggest wake-up call to say, hey, look, you know what? It is time to really start putting our well-being, our health, our lifestyles first. I mean, what's your experience been of that? And, can you talk about some of those real risks with COVID and how your food choices, how it can impact that potentially?
Yeah, I mean, I would hope that we're going to have a wake-up call around this, Rangan, but I'm not hopeful. I don't know what it's like in the UK, but in America, it's like crickets here, except for Bill Maher, who screams on television about how we need to face the fact that the reason in America we're overwhelmed by COVID is because we're metabolically so unhealthy. 88% of Americans have poor metabolic health, which means that they're like in the spectrum of prediabetes, which means they have belly fat, which means they have inflammation. And so when the COVID lands on them, it's almost 9 out of 10 Americans, they're like a sitting duck. And so it's like putting gasoline on a fire, and all of a sudden you get this cytokine storm that ends up killing people. And wherever you are on that spectrum, we know that the poor metabolic health is a driver for really bad outcomes. With that said, people don't understand that within a very short time, a couple of weeks maybe, you can really radically reverse your poor metabolic health. And I'll just give you a quick example. We had a type 2 diabetic on insulin for 10 years, heart failure, angina, liver, kidneys failing. I mean, she was a mess. She was had a body mass index of 43, which normal is under 25. Over 30 is obese. She was in the severely obese category. 65 years old and taking insulin every day and tons of medications. Within 3 days of changing her diet, like 3 days, she was off her insulin completely. Within 3 months, she was off all her medications and her metabolic parameters were all normal in blood sugar, cholesterol, blood pressure, everything, kidneys, liver. And so it might take 30 years to get there. It can be very quick to get back. And even if you don't lose all the weight, I mean, if you're, for example, a gastric bypass patient and you have diabetes, you get your gastric bypass, within a week or so, your diabetes is gone. You're still very overweight because it takes a little longer to lose weight, but your diabetes is gone. So your metabolic health, level of inflammation, all can change very quickly in response to your diet. So I wouldn't feel discouraged if you have issues. I would double down on eating what we've talked about today on the show, the vegan diet, or just a similar whole foods philosophy approach, and it will have a profound effect on your immune system.
I just wanted to touch on one of the principles is around habit change, one of the chapters, which is super interesting. And there's a few things in there I really liked, but one of the things that you wrote was friend power is more important than willpower. And you shared how at the Cleveland Clinic, how you guys use groups and how powerful that can be. And so, for people listening who have tried to change before, struggle to do it by themselves, I think this could be quite a helpful tip for them, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, for years, I studied the minutiae of functional medicine. I was sort of a nerd about the biochemistry, the genomics, the physiology, the microbiome. And I just wanted to know every little aspect of our cellular functioning and all this sort of nerdy stuff. And I was really good at getting people healthy if they did what I tell them to do. But often, we know in medicine that half of people don't fill the prescriptions they get and half that do don't take them. So the doctor writes a prescription for a statin, 25% of the people take it and 75% don't. So that's not a good odds. And I think in medicine and nutrition and what we're doing, it's maybe even harder. So, I had this epiphany a number of years ago, well over 10 years ago, when I went to Haiti and met Paul Farmer, who was able to deal with TB and AIDS in one of the worst places in terms of healthcare and poverty in the world, Haiti, not by better drugs or surgery or technology, but just by the power of community. He called it accompaniment, and he trained thousands of community health workers to help each other, accompany each other to health and make sure they took their medications. Because we know how to cure TB and AIDS, essentially treat them using the right cocktails of medications, but these people didn't have a watch, they didn't have running water, they didn't have often a place to be. I mean, so it was dealing with a lot of these fundamental, we call structural violence issues, the social, economic, and political conditions that drive disease. We see that in this country, with food swamps and food deserts. I'm sure it's like that in the UK too. And I think we have a tremendous sort of deficit of understanding how we really can get an environment that supports people to health. And so the big epiphany for me was, okay, I know how to change biology, but I'm going to fail unless I understand how to change behavior. And so I realized at the same time when Paul was treating infectious disease using this model, I was like, wait a minute. I said, wait a minute. Chronic disease is also contagious, right? Obesity is also contagious. You're far more likely to be overweight if your friends are overweight than if your family is overweight. We know that your social threads that connect you are maybe more important, your genetic threads in determining your health outcomes. We just know this from the science. So if that's true, if your bad behavior, it goes along with bad habits. In other words, if all your friends are, eating at McDonald's and smoking and drinking beer and having Coca-Cola, you're probably going to be doing the same thing. But if all your friends are, drinking green juices and going to yoga, well, you might be doing that. So there's a tremendous amount of peer pressure that we all are subjected to because we're social animals. It's how we live. We have to be social or else we would die as humans. We're not like a wild lion that can roam around by himself or whatever and just eat whatever he wants. Like we're dependent on each other. And so what we know is that it's much more effective to use friend power than to use willpower when you want to change behavior, and particularly for chronic disease. So I kind of had this experiment that we did with this church in Southern California where we got 15,000 people to sign up for a 6-week healthy living program, sort of faith-based wellness program. And it was striking what happened. People just did so well. They lost, over the course of a year, they lost 250,000 pounds, probably like, I don't know how many stone that is, but it's a lot of weight. And I think we saw that the power of these community-based solutions was so massive. And it wasn't even an expert. They had these groups that they had in the church that were met every week to support each other. So they would meet in 6 to 8 people, and it would have these little learning sessions. And we just sort of substituted in the curriculum for the healthy living, and they support each other. They encourage each other. They held each other accountable. They had jogging for Jesus, they had like all kinds of stuff that they did to actually do stuff together. And that was an insight for me that I was like, wait a minute, this is how we have to change medicine. And so at Cleveland Clinic, we're doing the same thing, and we're about to publish our data in the British Medical Journal, actually, soon, where we show that the group visits, the community support, was more effective than one-on-one visits with a functional medicine doctor, which were more effective than with a traditional doctor. So we've got some interesting data about the power of this model to really accelerate change in terms of the speed of recovery and getting better, but also the adherence and the level of change. So I'm excited about using this model, and we're trying to scale this up around the country and use this power of community. I call it love is medicine. So food is medicine. Love is also medicine.
Yeah, I love it, Mark. Mark, you've just, you're someone who has been dedicated to the cause of empowering and inspiring people, both patients and physicians, all over the world for so many years. I can't imagine what it's been like for you. I'm sure you faced all kinds of opposition at various times, but you're driven in that mission, and it's fantastic to see. It's very inspiring. I know for many, for many of my colleagues, for myself, we see what you have been doing and how you have paved the way for many of us to start spreading our messages. I want to publicly acknowledge you for that and say thank you.
Thank you.
And just to finish off, Mark, it's, as I say, it's The Peak of Diet is a brilliant book. I think it really helps to simplify nutrition for people. Some core principles there. I always love to leave my listeners with some actionable tips. So we covered a lot of ground today. Phytonutrients, we covered the climate, regenerative farming, kids, all kinds of things. But just to bring it all down for people at the end, this is called Feel Better, Live More. When we feel better in ourselves, we get more out of life. What are some of your top tips for people listening to the show right now?
Well, I try to synthesize this at the end of the book and, sort of getting started. And it's just some simple things that are easy to remember. First, when you're going to eat something, ask yourself a simple question. Did God make this, or did man make it? If you don't believe in God, is it a nature made? So did God make an avocado? Yeah. Did he make a Twinkie? No. If God made it, you can eat it. If nature made it, you could eat it. But if man made it, you probably don't want to eat it, right? Second is a similar idea is, try not to eat food with labels. Or if it has a label, make sure you read very carefully what the ingredients are. If it's broccoli, it just says broccoli. If it's a piece of chicken, it's chicken. If it's an egg, it's an egg. If it's an almond, it's an almond. It doesn't have a label or nutrition facts. And so most of the food I like to eat is without labels. Now, sometimes, if you want to buy a package of nuts, it might say a label on it, and then it has your little nutrition facts on it. It might say salt or something. Or if you buy a can of sardines, it might say olive oil and sardines and salt. That's okay. But just try to avoid foods with labels. The next kind of principle is if you don't have it in your kitchen cupboard or you can't pronounce it, you probably won't want to eat it, right? So if you have a jar of butylated hydroxytoluene in your cupboard that you sprinkle on your stir fries, probably not. But it's otherwise known as BHT, banned in most of Europe, but available here in the United States. And it's a carcinogenic preservative. So you don't want to eat that stuff. Also, when you go shopping, don't go down the middle of the aisles. Stick around the outside where there's just real food, vegetables, and the produce, and the dairy and the meat section. If you're eating, just focus on plants. Like I always focus on 2 or 3 servings of plant dishes at each meal, whether it's just asparagus or mushrooms or salad. So last night I had beets, we had mushrooms, I had salad, and we had sweet potato. So we had like four vegetable dishes and a small piece of meat on the side. So that's where meat is a condiment. or condiment meat. And fat is so important. So remember to eat good fats. Olive oil, avocados are my favorite. But there's other good fats too. Make sure you eat a lot of phytonutrients. You want to pick your medicines in your food. So like learn about some of the colors and what they have, and try to eat like the rainbow as a way of getting phytochemicals. It's an easy thing to do. And, enjoy nuts and seeds, and certain beans are fine. And enjoy your food. I mean, it's just got to be fun and delicious and pleasurable. So I wouldn't really get crazy about following a particular thing. I don't count calories. I don't count carb grams, fat grams, protein grams. I don't think of any of that. I just think about what I eat. If you focus on what you eat and quality, you don't have to worry about how much you eat. Literally. I mean, I could eat, a giant bowl of salad till I couldn't move and nothing would happen, right? So I think you can find out what your natural rhythm is in your biology by just getting on real food, and then actually just focusing on quality. And if you focus on quality, all the rest takes care of itself. Diseases, weight, metabolism, all that.
Yeah, love it, Mark. If you enjoyed that conversation, I think you are going to love the one that I had with Professor Tim Spector, all about foods. It's right there. So give it a click and let me know what you think.
If you snack a couple of hours before a meal, your metabolic response to that meal is poorer than if you didn't snack.
Okay, just say that again, because I think that's really important.